Hi, I'm Linard, and today I'm presenting our latest work, Sound Verification of Security Protocols, from design to interoperable implementations. This is joint work by researchers from ETH Zurich as well as IRISA in France. As many of you probably know, there is a large body of literature out there on formalizing protocols as well as proving security properties in the symbolic model of cryptography. In fact, we even have automatic tools such as Tamarin or ProVerif that can automatically verify security properties for such models. And these tools have been successfully applied in the past to prove security properties for many interesting protocols such as TLS, 5G, or EMV. However, at the end of the day, we're executing implementations and not our models for which we have proven all these nice properties. So there are several questions that immediately arise. Does the implementation follow the model, or do we have a gap that we somehow have an issue in the implementation, or we did a modeling mistake? Are there any additional vulnerabilities that show up in the implementation but not in the model? For example, the classical buffer overflow and corresponding attacks. And lastly, we want to have our implementations to be safe, meaning there is no undefined behavior or divisions by zero. And our approach provides answers to these questions. Specifically, we are bridging the gap between verification of protocol models in Tamarin on the one side and verification of implementations in off-the-shelf program verifiers on the other side. Our approach provides a preservation of security properties, meaning the properties we have verified in Tamarin will also hold for the implementations we are executing. So let's have a closer look on how our approach works in detail. In the first step, we either take an existing protocol model or we model the protocol at hand. We then use Tamarin's automated proof search to prove that the security properties we are interested in actually hold for the protocol model. In the second step, we apply our automatic tool to generate I/O specifications for each protocol role based on the Tamarin model. Intuitively, these I/O specifications describe the permitted I/O behavior for each protocol role. And in the final step, we take existing implementations, for example in Go and Java, and apply off-the-shelf program verifiers, for example Gobra and Verifast, to prove that these implementations are A, safe to execute, and B, follow the I/O specification. To illustrate this further, let's consider this very simple protocol here. Alice and Bob start off with a pre-shared symmetric key. Alice will generate a nonce n, send this to Bob, and Bob will reply with a hash of this nonce n. As mentioned, we formalize this in Tamarin, and the corresponding Tamarin file looks roughly as follows. So there is a section describing the environment. Here the environment is mostly concerned with setting up this pre-shared key and initializing an initial state for Alice and Bob containing this pre-shared key. Then we have some section describing Alice's behavior as well as Bob's behavior. We can prove in Tamarin here fully automatically that the secrecy for this nonce n holds, as well as that these two participants non-injectively agree on nonce n. Since the rest of the presentation will focus on Bob's role, let's have a closer look at the behavior of Bob. So Bob has two transition rules. The first transition rule states that Bob starts in an initial state S0 that contains the pre-shared key, receives a message from the network, which is here represented by this infect with the expected message structure, transitions to state S1, and then the second transition rule mentions that Bob transitions from state S1 to state S2 and outputs the response. We can now move on and look at one possible implementation of Bob. Here we see a main function that takes this pre-shared key as input, first receives a message from the network, performs some parsing operations to make sure that the message we just received is actually the first protocol message. And if it is, it constructs the response and then finally sends the response. We can now apply our automatic tool to the Tamarin model to obtain the I/O specification for Bob. This I/O specification is in the dialect of separation logic, which is called I/O separation logic. And we can provide now this specification as a precondition to the main function. Intuitively, this specification contains a bunch of permissions. Each permission represents the permission to call a certain I/O operation with particular parameters. So whenever we do an I/O call, we have to prove that we possess the corresponding permission. Now let's see how verification proceeds for this body. Since we are, as a first statement, call receive, we have to prove that we can call receive, meaning we have the corresponding permission. So we can unfold here our specification to obtain the corresponding permission. Then we proceed by parsing the just received message, and afterwards we know that the message we just received has the expected shape. Since we know that we are currently in the initial state of Bob in our model state, we can now conceptually apply the first transition as stated in the Tamarin model. We do this by calling this internal operation, for which we again need to unfold the specification. Now we are conceptually in model state S1, and we can proceed by applying the second transition, very similarly by calling the second internal operation. Bob will now proceed by generating or constructing the response, and before we can then finally call the send operation, we have to prove that we are allowed to send and have the corresponding permission, and we can now here again unfold the specification where we exchange the out fact by a corresponding send permission. And now this concludes the code level verification. So we have now seen a very abstract version on how code level verification works. I hope you got some idea. I had to unfortunately omit several details here, but I think I covered the most important parts. Now let's zoom it out again to our approach, and I guess you're probably wondering by now, why is it even sufficient to only prove the security properties on the level of Tamarin? Well, what our approach achieves is a refinement relation. In particular, all the possible protocol traces that are possible when we execute the implementations in the presence of a symbolic attacker are guaranteed to be contained in the traces described by the specification, and those in turn are contained in the traces that satisfy the security properties we have proven in Tamarin. And well, by these two trace inclusions, we obtain the preservation of security properties. Now, comparing with related work, we not only achieve here a very nice level and very nice separation of concerns, meaning we only have to worry about the security properties in Tamarin and no longer on the implementation level. And this also allows us to target existing implementations. So we do not care whether Alice is implemented in Go and Bob is implemented in Java. All we need is a program verifier based on separation logic. We have evaluated our work on the WireGuard VPN protocol. This protocol is roughly split in a handshake and transport phase. So in the handshake phase, Alice and Bob negotiate a symmetric encryption key, which is then used to encrypt and send the actual VPN payloads. We have modeled this protocol in Tamarin. This amounts to about 400 lines of code. And in particular, we model that this protocol might send unboundedly many VPN payloads. We then took the official WireGuard Go implementation and simplified it slightly. In particular, we removed advanced VPN features such as DDoS protection, which would be orthogonal to our approach. The resulting code base is about 600 lines of Go code, and we have applied our Go verifier called Gobra. By applying our automatic tool to the Tamarin model, we obtained 1,200 lines of generated I/O specification, and we required about 2,800 lines of proof annotations to prove memory safety, meaning absence of buffer overflows and undefined behavior, as well as connecting the I/O specification with the implementation as illustrated earlier. To conclude, we have a sound end-to-end verification approach that bridges the gap between protocol models and implementations, and we have an automatic tool to generate the necessary I/O specification. If you're interested and want to learn more, check out our paper. There you have a soundness proof for the refinement, as mentioned earlier, as well as our novel approach to relate symbolic terms that arise in the model with the concrete bytes and byte arrays in the implementation. I had to omit this for time reasons, but this is a very interesting and crucial aspect to target existing implementations and real-world protocols that we allow certain collisions for the symbolic terms, meaning that multiple terms map to the same byte level representation. So thanks a lot for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Do we have any questions? Please approach the mic in the middle of the room.
Great talk, really enjoyed it. Quick question, so can you give us a flavor for what the maintenance would look like? So imagine that you convince the WireGuard folks that they should sort of keep this proof around forever and that they should sort of carry it forward as they modify the code. What do you think the overhead there looks like to maintain the proof annotations and all of this along with the code itself, the implementation?
That's a very interesting question. Thanks a lot. So I think the connection between the implementation and the I/O specification is more or less straightforward. You have like these pretty clearly defined points where you call I/O, like send, receive, or these internal operations. So as you move code in your code base, you basically need to move the corresponding unfolding operations, as we have seen earlier. So I think most of the work will probably be concerned with maintaining the memory safety proof, where, well, yeah, if you change your data structures, there is some work involved, which I guess is standard for program verifiers and not that concerned with our approach. Thanks.
Very cool, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, I have one. So you show how to certify trace properties. But what about observational equivalence properties? Do you think that you can use relational program verifiers to verify them?
That's a tough question. So yes, this work is only focused on trace properties. So I think for relational properties, I think there would be quite some work involved on the program verifier side. But I think also we would need to strengthen our approach to still maintain this trace inclusion property and actually have a refinement. So I think this would be a non-trivial extension of the approach.
Right, thank you. We have another question.
Hi, nice talk. Just a question, I'm curious. You mentioned input-output. What about confidentiality, say, of keys and other secret material? Is there any measure that you take in implementation to ensure that?
You mean when you serialize a key and store it on disk, or more information flow?
Exactly. So like long-term secrets like those you had in the protocol. So for instance, how do you check that they are not global variables that are somehow ending in untrusted modules or stuff like this?
Yeah, so if you would consider storing keys on disk, I guess we would need to treat these as I/O operations as well. We don't do this so far. And for information flow, yes, we don't consider information flow here, but one could extend this with classical approaches to information flow security for program verifiers like modular product programs.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So we can move on to our next speaker. Thank you.